Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey friends, thank you for either listening to or watching this podcast of E2 Effective Elders, and how grateful we are to CDF Capital for making it possible. We're getting pretty close to the end of the year 2022, and it's been a year focusing on what we call a good word. And every month we have been focused on a word that builds up, that edifies, that challenges us to be stronger in our walk with Jesus Christ. Now, we begin the month of November. And on this first Tuesday of November, we want to introduce the word humility. There's our good word of the month, humility. And it's a powerful word. And all month long, we're going to unpack humility. Now, I've got in my hand here today a towel, and I'll explain this towel at the end of this very brief podcast. In the book of Philippians, we read this great thank you letter of Paul to the church in Philippi. Now, a little bit of context before we get into the content. Typically, we look at that letter and we think it is just that, a thank you letter of Paul to the church in Philippi for the support that they gave to him while he was incarcerated. It's one of the prison letters. But I think that if we go a little bit deeper still, we will see a lot of the context. For example, in chapter 4, you will notice right away in verse 2 that the Apostle Paul calls out two women there in the church, Euodia and Syntyche. Now, picture this. He's written this letter, he's rolled up the scroll, he's put a seal on it, and it's being delivered to the lead elder at Philippi. He gets mail, and he sends out word to the church, hey, we've got mail, we've got mail. We're having church tonight. So the church assembles, he breaks the seal, and he begins reading this letter from their beloved friend Paul. And he gets to this section where he writes, I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche to get along. Can you imagine those ladies in the room hearing them being called out by name because they were not at their best relationally? Something was broken in their relationship, and that relationship needed to be healed. Well, Paul went even further to talk about that issue in chapter 2. Beginning in verse 1, we find out another dimension that was broken in and among the people of Philippi. Remember, a church is not an address, it's not a building, it's not a time of service. The church is people, and people are in relationship. Now, in verse 1 and following, Paul says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness or compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded. Have the same love, be one in spirit and in purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, there's that word, in humility, consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only after your own interests, but also after the interests of one another. Stop right there. Verses 1 through 4. Why did Paul have to use ink and paper to write that? Because they were not at their best relationally. People in the church in Philippi must have been broken somehow in some way, and they needed those relationships to heal. Paul is saying very plainly and clearly, in humility, consider others better than yourselves. Don't look only after what matters to you, look also after the needs of others. And then he says in verse 5, now check this out, this is what is called the Christological statement. It's Paul's description of the ministry of Jesus. And beginning in verse 5, he says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Well, where does an attitude reside? Right here in the mind. It's how we think. In other words, Paul is saying you need to be thinking just the way Jesus thought. And remember, how we think leads to how we live. How we think determines how we live, how we act, how we behave. So your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man. Christ humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Look at that. Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but he made himself nothing. A word that means he poured out himself. He emptied himself, any desire to be equal to God, and he put on flesh, and he humbled himself. That word humility means to go to a lower place, and he literally did that, even to the place of dying on a cross. He humbled himself, became obedient to death, even death on a cross. That is how we are to think, and how we think determines how we live. As a Christ follower, you and I as Christians, I-A-N-S, that suffix means Christ ones. We are ones who belong to Christ. We follow his teaching. We follow his example. So what does that mean? We humble ourselves. We deny ourselves. Humility is going to a lower place. Many times I tell the story of Nick Wallenda. He's of the Wallenda family, high wire aerialists. And when he was going across a high wire suspended above Niagara Falls, another one suspended over the Grand Canyon, afterwards he was interviewed, and someone asked him, how do you handle your pride? All these people were asking for his autograph. How do you handle your pride? And he just chuckled and he said, well, you know what? I better handle it, because in the good book, the Bible, it says pride goes before a fall, and in my line of business, that would be pretty serious. He said, I go out to the truck and I get industrial grade trash bags, and I come back and I pick up everybody's trash after you've left. And you see, he said then, I have to move into humility. So the star of the show became the servant of all. You and I, if we are going to heal broken relationships, it starts with humility. It begins with humility, thinking more highly of others than we do ourselves. This towel, we have to remember that before Jesus went to the cross, in that upper room, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, even the feet of Judas, the one who would betray him to death. And Jesus knew who he was, and yet he lowered himself. He went to a lower place at the feet of Judas and washed his feet. That, my friends, is the example that we are called to follow. Humility heals. Every week, we're going to see another property of humility. And for the rest of the month, a surprise awaits as we share with you our brief podcast on a good word. Humility heals.